Hi, good evening, everybody. I've had a call where they've told me that not many of you might make it because you are navigating stress in other places. So I'm very happy to do the recording this evening. If we're a small group, that's actually lovely. And then we will make the recording available. I'll actually split it into a few different pieces, and then people can also watch it for, because we'll need some of the theory for our meeting next week. So I'm hoping more people will be able to make it next week. We've got 3 of you at the moment, and I'm absolutely comfortable to teach 3 people. That's not a problem at all. And it's more of an opportunity so we can actually record this information and make it available to anybody at the school that might need it. So because we just 4, we can actually do introductions. Sometimes I just get people to introduce in the chat, otherwise the whole meeting is introductions. But I'd love it if you would just unmute yourself, obviously just give me your name and just tell me what classes you are teaching at the moment.
Hi, Madeleine, my name's Rob, and I teach class 10, 11, 12 for main lessons, 12 for English, and I'm a matric teacher of 2 subjects.
Ooh, okay, so you guys are also in crunch time now with exams and things coming up. Great, thank you,
Yeah.
welcome. Adele, it might be easier just to call people out.
I can go.
Okay, great. Yes.
There we go. Found it. I found the unmute button. Hi, Adele. I'm doing eurythmy and I teach from class 1 to class 8.
Okay, wonderful. Great. Yes, Sarah.
Hi, I'm the art teacher for class 9 to 12, and then I teach matric visual arts.
Okay. Oh, lovely. Great. And then teen, how does one say that?
It's Scandinavian, so you would say Tina, probably.
Yeah,
but
okay.
I am a class teacher, but currently I'm not holding a class. I'm doing lots of different things. I'm doing a bit of teaching, class 7 maths, class 11 ceramics. Then I'm doing some individual teacher mentoring, first time around teachers, and some Waldorf enrichment, sort of background to some of the Waldorf principles to some of our teachers. And then I'm doing a lot of college work and parent enrichment work and meeting a lot of people individually and that type of thing.
So juggling lots of balls.
Yeah.
Welcome. And then David, I see you've just joined. Just an introduction of yourself and what class you are teaching. He's looking for the unmute button. David, are you able to unmute and introduce yourself? If you're struggling, you can also just put something in the chat. Oh, there we go.
Hello. Hi. Sorry, I've just joined now. I've just gotten home.
Welcome.
I just picked up at the end your name and which class
Name
you're
and just
teaching.
class you teach. That's right. That's absolutely fine. Yes.
Yeah. So I teach in the upper high school maths and physical science, and I teach chemistry main lessons to varied classes.
Welcome, welcome. We were just saying we've heard that quite a few teachers are actually caught up, so we are recording this meeting, and we'll make it available this week as well for other people to also join, but we'll be a nice small group tonight, which is lovely in terms of interaction possibility, which is great.
Okay, cool.
So what we're going to be doing tonight is actually, I'm using the word stress, but we're actually going to be looking at the effects on the way our brains work in a variety of different scenarios. And it's going to help us about managing difficult teenagers, which is probably the reason why most of us join them training like this. But it actually might also assist you in navigating complicated relationships in home and at the workplace. So interestingly, that difficult college meeting that might be taking place, some of this might be useful for that as well. But we're also going to talk a little bit about what makes this difference between thriving and surviving. And I generally find when I'm teaching, I teach this work to medical students, to doctors, to interns. I do a lot of mentoring in rural facilities. And I also teach in normal schools. And I always find the Waldorf, the thriving, there's much more of a an ability to thrive than sometimes we find in the normal schools, where the teachers are literally just feeling like they're holding on by their fingertips. But we're going to look at all of these aspects to this evening. Before we get going, I want to just get an idea of where we are at in terms of anthroposophical language, so to speak. And don't worry, I'm not actually planning on using anthroposophical language. I'm going to launch a poll. Now, some people's phones and things don't always cooperate with polls. That's absolutely fine. If you find you can't see the poll or it's not showing up, there's 2 questions and you can just put it in the chat. And the first question is in how confident you feel on the concept of fourfold man, so physical, etheric, astral body, eye organization. And you've got 4 options. You don't know it at all, or you're aware of it, but there's still some gaps, or you know it, you've got a fairly good idea of what we mean by fourfold man, or actually you actually explain and teach it to other people. And then the second question is about your confidence on the concept of threefold man. So that's your nerve, sense, rhythmical, metabolic, limb classification. And again, not know it at all, or you're aware of the concept, but there's still some gaps. You've got a fairly good idea of the concept and that you're confident and able to explain it to others. We're a small group, so there'll only be a few little answers.
Madeleine, sorry, have you sent this to our phones?
No, it will appear on your screen. If it doesn't appear on the screen, you can put an answer in the chat. So it's a Zoom function. It appears magically on the Zoom.
Okay, so
if it doesn't appear,
all right, good.
Something in the chat.
Okay, no.
Also not essential.
Okay.
Just to get a bit of an idea where you are. So you're a eurythmist, so I'm fairly sure that you're fairly confident on both threefold and fourfold man during your eurythmy training. But we can see we've got a mix here of different, some people not having come across much of it, some people having some gaps, some people having some idea of the concepts. And I think this is what we normally find in Waldorf schools. Although we say that sort of anthroposophy lies behind what we do, not all of us are anthroposophists, and we don't all need to be anthroposophists. So the first thing I'm going to talk about tonight is just in terms of understanding anthroposophy as the underlying philosophy in the Waldorf schools and how we communicate that. So I have a small issue with how we communicate anthroposophy. And I think it's important to understand that anthroposophy has almost 3 levels on how we describe knowledge. And of course, what we're trying to do in anthroposophy is we're trying to define what I'm going to call the supersensible. So those are things that we cannot observe through any of our senses or any machines that can copy our senses. So a good example is, I want you all to think of a song. Let's do Queen's We Will Rock You, because everybody knows that song. When you think of that song in your head, you will hear Freddie Mercury singing, you will hear the drums. You can actually hear the tune in your head. You don't just hear yourself singing it in your head. But if I was to put any fancy piece of equipment in your head, I can't actually play that song. So the experience of you being able to hear a song in your head, there's no data file out of your brain that I can download with a clever device and then hear what song you are singing in your head. And we don't even have a prospect of doing that because there's no data, audio files that gets captured in the brain. So that we call supersensible. And of course, there's lots of different hypotheses on what underlies this so-called supersensible. So in anthroposophy, there's different levels. The first side is what I'm going to call anthroposophical science. That's where my interest lies. So Steiner, when he was speaking about his observations of the supersensible and his understanding of the supersensible, he talked a lot about you have to be able to observe everything about the supersensible through the way it manifests within the physical world. So we should, without being clairvoyant, be able to observe the phenomenon of the supersensible world through good observation, which we obviously do through what we call Goethean science. The second part of that is anthroposophical philosophy, which is now starting to put ideas and theories behind what it is that we're observing. So, and then the third aspect is what I'm going to call anthroposophical religion. So this is when we start having ideas and theories about what's happened before birth and what's happened after death. So anthroposophical science is typically threefold man, fourfold man, and most of it is actually observable phenomenon that we're just describing through a specific language. Anthroposophical philosophy interprets these observations and start having these ideas of souls and spirit. These are ideas and interpretations. They are not something that you can convince somebody else through an observable experiment, for example. So anthroposophical science, we're on fairly solid ground. Everybody can understand the concepts and everybody will be able to observe the concepts. But when you get to anthroposophical philosophy, that becomes a little bit more personal and a little bit more opinionated, if I can call it this way. It's our own understanding. I'm a big fan of anthroposophy, but not everybody necessarily has the same interpretations of the observations. And then, of course, anthroposophical religion really deals with much more supersensible and much more undefinable concepts, which you cannot possibly prove to anybody else. Here, we actually have to believe what we think it is that happens before and after birth, before birth and after death. The reason why I highlight this is that in Waldorf education, we are basing everything we do in Waldorf education on anthroposophical science. Many of us love anthroposophical philosophy and religion, and we can have it in our own personal lives, and it might enrich our understanding of these observational phenomenon. But for me, that does not belong anywhere within our communication about what we do in a Waldorf school. And the reason why I say that is because what we are finding, because people quite often mix in a lot of philosophy and religion when they talk about Waldorf, what ends up happening is we have seen a lot of Waldorf schools getting closed down. In England at the moment, that's been a disaster. One of the schools I worked at for many years, one of the oldest schools, actually got closed down last year, and there's been a huge process in trying to reopen. And part of that has been our difficulty in communicating what we do. Because what's amazing about Waldorf is that if you look at the educational principles in Waldorf, the science, modern science, is caught up with anthroposophical science. We all have the same understanding of what needs to happen in education, for example, and we can completely justify what we are doing. But as soon as we start using anthroposophical language, and a language that's very outdated, if I can put it that way, we start creating rifts between us and our communities. So any parent, no matter what religion or what philosophical or what background they come from, should be able to understand what we're doing in Waldorf and should be able to feel their children benefit from what Waldorf does. And we must remember that Rudolf Steiner, lovely as he was, I'm a big fan, but he was a white, heterosexual, cisgendered German man who lived 100 years ago in Northern Europe. And a lot of these concepts and ideas that he brought is very dated in the language that he uses. So on purpose, my presentation, this is the last bit of anthroposophy you're going to get. I'm not going to use anthroposophical language. For those of you familiar with threefold and a little bit of fourfold, I mostly work with threefold, you will certainly see that coming through. But I want to be able to create a language in the way we talk about stress and relationships that is based on anthroposophy, but where we are using modern language. And that makes it possible to communicate with our teenagers, with our parents, with our governing bodies, with our communities, and start being able to show why the work that we do with our children is so important. So I'm also making the assumption that a lot of what I'm covering real basic stuff, and some of it might already be quite familiar to you. So if you find you go, oh no, actually I'm the converted, I understand and know all of this, I've been working with this all my life, then I'd like you to think of this, then this is something I would like you to go and teach. And I would like you to look at how we use language and metaphors to actually teach threefold, for example, to your parent community. So without any further ado, we're going to start off by talking about the anatomy of stress. So we're going to look at the neuroscience behind stress. And the interesting thing, which we know and we forget, is that you're not always the same person. And neither is the person that you're talking to. We have, and I'm going to divide it into literally two different selves. And we have these two different modes that are run by two different parts of the brain. So neuroscience helps to explain why people, and even some of you can sometimes be a real pain in the ass. And it has to do with this interesting interaction here. If you look at the brain in the top here, you will see there are these two parts of the brain. We have a prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of our eye organization. And we have this limbic survival brain in the center there, which is the seat of the astral body. And our whole conversation today is going to be about how those two interact and how you can better describe it to your adolescents and your parents about how those two interact. So you are always in two different modes, and these modes are physiologically determined. They are determined by what's happening in your endocrines, in your brain, or in your body, which are literally just vehicles for what we call supersensible phenomenon. So the two modes that we talk about is survival mode, which is our parasympathetic fight-flight system. On this side, and you can see on the bottom here, I've got my limbic brain, my survival brain, and survival brain, when adrenaline is up, survival brain's in charge, we are in survival mode. When we're not in survival mode, there's another system in charge, which we call the parasympathetic system, for those of you who teach life science, that I'm going to call creative mode. And in this mode, the prefrontal cortex is the one that's actually giving the cues. So when you are in one of these two modes, your physical body literally changes. So if you're in survival mode, and I'm sure you all know this, your fight-flight system kicks in, your blood pressure goes up, your heart rate goes up, your whole muscles, all your muscles go into full activation, no blood to the gut, you know, that typical performance anxiety you might get, or any scenario where you're feeling stressed. If you're on creative mode, your blood pressure comes back down, your heart rate comes back down, all the blood flow goes to your gut, and you are now suddenly in a different mode. So great, this we all know. What we forget is that it changes how you think. It changes your inner life depending on which mode you're in. And we're going to spend a lot of time on this. So if you're on a survival brain-led mode versus your prefrontal cortex mode, we're going to look at three different levels, threefold. So we're going to be looking at how it affects our thinking. We're going to be looking at how it affects our emotional landscape. I'm going to call it the jungle and the temple. And we're going to look at how it affects our metabolic behavior system. And I'm going to call that the chimp and the sage. And we're now going to go through these polarities in a little bit more detail. So let's start just with the thinking and how these two modes affect our thinking. So just to help us, and this you guys can just put in the chat. I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to just put in the chat what you think the predominant emotion is that this woman might be feeling. I'm going to bring up my little chat screen. So find your chat and just tell me, what do you think emotion, what do you think is going through her feeling life at the moment? There we go. Oh, I've got already two, very quick. Well done. Add to the chat there. So we've got disgust, we've got outrage. She definitely looks very angry. And what I want you to have an experience of this is how quickly you came to some sort of conclusion on what you think is actually going on for this woman. There we go, rage as well, bewilderment. Excellent. So we very quickly look at this woman and we have an extreme impression of what we think is going on. The slow thinking, fast thinking theory, I'm basing on an amazing book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. For those of you who love behavioral science, he's actually an economist and has won a Nobel Prize for economists, Daniel Kahneman. And this book focuses a lot on how biases are created. And so he describes these two systems in quite a lot of detail. So fast thinking is mostly linked to that limbic survival brain of us. And it's this thing where we are screening the world around us and very quickly come to conclusions or very quickly think about the world. So this is our automatic and easy thinking system. It's the way we can quickly navigate what happens to us from moment to moment. So it's quite emotional thinking. So we're able to read faces. We quickly make emotional interpretations about the world around us. And we love making assumptions. So we'll quickly guess something, we'll quickly make up our mind what we think somebody might be thinking or what they might be feeling or what we might be thinking is going on. And this is, of course, one of the big causes of bias in our thinking. It's quite unstable and inconsistent because it's quick, it comes to a conclusion now and it gets affected by how we're feeling about something. And it loves jumping to an opinion. Oh, social media, we'll talk a lot about social media, and the survival system loves, very quickly having a reaction to whatever you're seeing. And fast thinking is very black and white. So if you think in terms of your survival system, you don't want to be weighing up too many pros and cons when you're in a scenario where you might be in danger. You want to come to a conclusion very quickly. So everything is either very good or very bad. There's no grays in between. This thinking is very powerful, and we mustn't underestimate how we tend to, as default, will go for the fast thinking. It's easy, it's quick, it's powerful, it's like our supercomputer. but it's not very bright. So it's not the most intelligent part of us, but it's a part that we can access easily and doesn't take a lot of effort to use. So now we're going to try a different exercise. In your heads, please, not allowed to use a calculator. I'd like you to calculate 17 times 24 and to please put that in the chat for me. Let's see who gets there first. Right, we're just waiting. Calculate 17 times 24. If you're watching this at home, try and do this in your head. No, I'm sure there was a maths teacher in there. Yes. Come on, 17 times 24. Nothing yet. Nothing yet. We'll see, maybe in a moment a number will come up. What I'd like you to have an experience of is how hard that is. So we can all do the sum. We understand. Oh, there's some answers coming through. Well done, guys. Poor David's been put on the spot. That's 17. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's supposed to be a multiplication. 17 times 24. Everybody's thinking, why do I put such an easy sum up there? 17 times 24. I'm going to have to fix that. Apology. David, even that was a bit tricky, hey? So 17 times 24, apologies. So math sum in your head. And what I wanted you just to have an experience of is when you're trying to do a math sum, like 17 times 24, you will have an experience of, oh, now I have to focus. Now I have to concentrate. It takes much slower. And you're now engaging what we're going to call slow thinking. So this book on the bottom here, Philosophy of Freedom, that was Rudolf Steiner's first big treatise that he wrote. And he actually made a statement later about the philosophy of freedom, because the philosophy of freedom is about this strengthening our thinking, our slow thinking part. And he wrote the book especially in such a way to make it really hard so that when you read it, you have to engage that slow thinking part of yourself. So the book in itself is like a thinking exercise. So when we think of slow thinking, it requires focus, attention, and effort. You need to be able to, it's usually the part of our brain that can interpret information. It looks for facts, it looks for truth. This is where we do our evidence-based, rational, logical thinking, where you really think something through. What's the pros? What's the cons? You now can understand the context and the perspective of everything that you are considering. And here you get your shades of gray and your balanced judgment. Well, it could be this or it could be that. Oh, spelling mistake still, apologies. So this kind of thinking is much slower. It's much harder to use that part of our brain, but here's where our true intelligence lies. And we're a little bit lazy. We like to go for the fast thinking over the slow thinking system in most scenarios. So now I want to move on to the emotional landscape, and I'm going to call this the jungle versus the temple. And we're going to start off with a jungle. So when we're in survival mode, we are in the jungle. And of course, the purpose of survival mode is survival. So we share that with the animal kingdom. That's the astral body was its first and primary thing, is to try and keep us safe and keep our species safe. And this is where all our instincts lie. And of course, the most well-known instinct is our fight, flight, and freeze. So whenever we feel a danger, we have a system that kicks in that's supposed to keep us safe. And it's directly linked to our endocrine system. So we literally feel ourselves when we're in the jungle. It is a very powerful physical experience when you're in jungle mode. We also have a variety of drives that's linked to this. It's also about survival. So of course, our drive for food, our drive for security and to feel safe, our drive for sex, we'll talk a lot about that next week, our drive for troop, family, and community, our drive for territory, dominance, and power. And you can already see just that territory, dominance, and power. If you want to wonder where is Putin at the moment and what's happening in the Ukraine, you can see we are in the jungle when you're on a war scenario. And this landscape, when you are in jungle landscape, the view that you have, I'm going to call street view. And I want you to imagine those video games. That's actually a screenshot out of a video game where the guys are running through the little narrow streets in the city, and you've got your gun and you're looking for the baddies, and all you can see is what's going to happen right in front of you. You don't know what's gone before, you don't know what's going to be around the next corner, and you can only think in that present time, and your only focus at that moment is how to survive. And you're guided from moment to moment by sympathy and antipathy. That scares me, that I don't like, that I like, and that seems safe, and that's where I want to go. So this is our survival mode that we enter into when we are in survival mode. The opposite of that is living in temple mode. And remember, these are endocrine linked. So when we're in the temple, and you can imagine, see that beautiful temple, it's up there on the mountains, looking out over the valley below. And the prefrontal cortex, or the ego organization, has got a very different purpose. Purpose is not survival. The purpose is now self-fulfillment, which is almost sometimes in contradiction to our so-called survival mode. So when we're in that mode, we're now operating by the laws of society. And now you get new qualities, different qualities coming through. Qualities such as honesty, compassion, and empathy. I like giving the example, when you're busy running away from that lion, that's not a time to think, shame, poor lion, he probably also needs to eat, and, it's conservation wise, it might be a good thing. You can't be empathic when you're in survival mode. You can only think about your own survival or the survival of those closest to you. It's only when you're in prefrontal cortex mode and all of that is settled down where you're actually able to step into somebody else's shoes. This is obviously the basis of our conscience. This is where we become law-abiding, because we can see the sense of why we have to drive on the left side of the road. And this is where all our self-control lies. So this is where we decide, okay, right now I'm not going to have that biscuit. Maybe I'll wait till after supper. Or right now I'm not actually going to follow my instincts on this one. And this, of course, is where we're able to be tolerant, flexible, and understanding of others. And you can see in a war scenario like what's happening in the Ukraine, that this is completely absent. There's no capacity to be able to try and even understand the implications of what's happening to others in that scenario. And in this, when we're in this, there are drives also when we are within the prefrontal cortex, but these are powerful ethical and moral drives that is guided by purpose and meaning. So I like to call this the balcony view. So now remember, street view, we were out in the jungle, we're fighting the baddies. Balcony view, we're able to step outside of that emotional landscape and look out over what is happening and understand what's coming and understand what's been before. So that brings us to the third aspect. So we talked about thinking, slow thinking, fast thinking. We talked about that jungle landscape versus the balcony view. And now we're going to what actually happens on behavior. And again, here I have to give credit to Prof. Steve Peters. He's a psychiatrist, actually wrote a lovely book called The Chimp Paradox, where he gives this metaphor of this chimp. He uses the survival system. When we're in survival mode, the behavior that we come up with, he calls chimp behavior, and we'll study the chimp in quite a lot of detail. So how does the chimp work? So remember, the chimp, it's all about survival mode, and the chimp behavior has got mainly, all he wants to do is you want to get rid of the threat. And if you can't get rid of the threat, you want to reduce your anxiety, and apologies for the spelling mistake again. So the chimp is all about, how am I going to feel a little bit safer? It lives very much in the present. So remember, street view, all that's important is what's happening right now. Fun entertainment, linked to the endocrine system, linked to sex and all of those great things. But it's quite self-focused, and it can be both quite proud, my, me, mine, what belongs to me, but quite insecure as well, because it's scared. Because it's all about survival, this is where all our paranoia and vigilance lies. So the chimp's always slightly on the lookout for what's going to threaten me, what's not cool, what might be disrespecting me, who might not be listening to me. And the favorite thing of the chimp is judgment, and what I would call emotive judgment. And we see that so strongly on social media, this ability to be completely flatten somebody and emotionally based purely on an emotional reaction of what you think and feel about something. The challenge with a chimp can be both cute and lovable, but the chimp can also become aggressive and dangerous. And we'll look a little bit at that and what happens in those scenarios. So the opposite of this is what we're going to call the sage. And this is how we behave when we're in that balcony view, when we're sitting on top of that hill, looking out over that beautiful landscape. And what the prefrontal cortex does, or what the ego organization does, is it observes and responds to what is happening. So where the chimp is always out there looking out, always trying to find trouble, the sage is sitting back and observing what is happening in that emotional landscape. And when it responds with perspective, because it understands what's happened before, it understands what's going to happen in the future. True joy lives here. So when the chimp is calmed down and the endocrine system is not so overreactive, this is where we're able to actually feel true joy. And here we have these amazing qualities. Again, empathy, being able to be generous, being able to be humble, and being able to be creative and innovative. So when you are creating your amazing main lessons, and I'm sure all of you have had that experience when you've created a great class and all the kids are busy with something they're passionate or that they're enjoying, with fun in the handwork and the art classes, that you are creating that atmosphere where we are working from our sage, not from our chimp. And I love this word. So remember, we had that emotive judgment that we get from the chimp. But when we're in sage mode, we can become generous in our assumptions. So when somebody else is behaving badly because they're in chimp mode, you can be generous and understand, okay, they're probably just having a bad day, and I'm not going to judge them just on the way they're behaving right now. And I think if we lived in a world where we were a bit more generous towards ourselves and each other in our assumptions, we would live in a slightly better place. And just like the chimp, behavior can be quite aggressive and dangerous. So when we're in sage mode, we actually have the potential to be really healing and truly loving to one another. So great. So we've got these two modes. Everybody has them. You don't have good people and bad people. We all have both of these aspects within ourselves. And what we have to understand is there's a switch. There's a switch that puts you in this mode, stress mode, versus creative mode. And that switch is triggered by adrenaline. It's an endocrine physiological reality. And adrenaline is triggered whenever we feel even slightly threatened. So when we don't feel safe, when we don't feel comfortable, when we're not sure about something, when anything might be, just adrenaline goes up, and we have more and more of a risk of ending up on that side of the scale. So we might be able to be wonderfully reasonable, excellent teachers who understand the bigger, larger picture of what our kids are going through. But in the classroom, if somebody pushes your buttons, right, you can suddenly find yourself in chimp mode and saying things that you would normally never, ever in your good right thought you would say. So how does this safety work? And I've got Maslow's little triangle down there, which I'm sure you all know. But there are 3 levels of safety that we all need to be able to feel at peace with ourselves. We obviously need to be bodily safe. So that's just not being threatened physically in some ways, not being in a car accident, not being sick. And I include financial security here. So it can be very stressful on a physical level if you don't have money for food, for example, or you don't have money to pay your mortgage or any of those things that might threaten your security. We also need to feel safe emotionally. So we need to feel safe that we are part of a troop, we are part of a family, we are loved, we are accepted, and there are people that are going to look after us. So bodily safety, we very much share with the animal kingdom. Emotional safety, we partly share with the animal kingdom. So the animals also have that. They feel they need to be part of their troop. They need to be included as part of their herd to be able to feel safe. And for human beings, there's also a strong feeling of love and acceptance. But the third level is very specific to human beings, and that is our need to be able to be independent and to have freedom of choice and freedom of expression. So to be able to, in South Africa, we have this amazing constitution, which gives us the right to be able to live our lives regardless of our race, regardless of our gender, regardless of our sexual orientation. We are able to have freedom of choice. We are able to choose what kind of profession we want to follow. We're able to choose where we want to travel to. And that freedom of choice is essential for us as human beings to also feel safe. And you can imagine there's lots of things in daily life that can make us feel unsafe on one of those 3 levels. So now let's put it together, right? So how does consciousness work? So we're talking that we've got one brain, obviously, or one consciousness that has to navigate it through the world. And you can almost think of it as a consciousness car or a consciousness vehicle. As a matter of fact, I've got a spaceship up here. Some of you might recognize that's the Star Trek bridge. And what I want you to notice is that in the front here, I've got the chimp, and that the chimp is always in the driver's seat. We have no choice. So the astral body or the central survival system is actually directly linked to our senses and directly linked to the environment around us. Everything that comes through the environment has to go through that front window and through the chimps first. And they're literally the ones that's driving and making first decisions. Here in the back sits the captain. Remember the slow thinking? A lot more effort to engage that captain or engage that sage. And when the chimp is going through, when we're busy going through life, the chimp's actually always screening and everything's all safe and everything is fine and the chimp will calm down and we can have these neutral automatic behaviors, or now the captain can actually come into play. It's when things get unsafe where it gets interesting. So then the chimp's supposed to ring the bells and big red lights go off everywhere, go into fight, flight, freeze response. And what's supposed to happen at this point is that the chimp is supposed to now make suggestions to the sage or the captain of the ship. Oh my goodness, this is happening. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then ideally, the captain is the one that should decide how we're actually going to manage the situation. And of course, the question we want to ask ourselves at any time in the day, who at the moment is navigating this consciousness journey? So the chimp is driving, but who is telling the chimp where to go? And sometimes we're not aware that who's actually driving at a particular moment in time. So I now want to just start looking at it within the context of neurodevelopment, because we're obviously talking about children and how this chimp and sage develops over a period of time. So this is now the development of the neurological system or the brain, or how the brain matures. And of course, when we are born, the chimp is conceived, comes into being. So now we have an astral body that is active while you're still in your mommy's tummy, prenatally. You are still being formed and created by these outer beings. It's only once actually come into the world that the astral body has to kick in. And of course, its main thing is to try and keep you safe. At this stage, it is still very unconscious as an astral body. It hasn't matured yet. And so it doesn't have consciousness of what it feels. It simply feels, I'm feeling unhappy and unhungry. I can't tell that I'm hungry. I'm just unhappy and I'm going to scream. And somehow miraculously, somebody's going to bring food. But the next thing that's going to happen is that at the age of 3 years old, we're going to start having our first prefrontal activity. So for the first time, and that's supposed to be cortex. See, I'm wearing my glasses now while I'm looking at the slides. So the prefrontal cortex wakes up. It's still very, very early days. So it's not yet myelinizing. It's not yet maturing, but we suddenly have that first ability to say I to ourselves. And we can now describe what the chimp is experiencing. I am hungry, or I want this, or I want to be picked up, or whatever that. So a first consciousness has arisen, but it's still very, very young. Between the ages of 3 and 9, we still live in a very unconscious space, and we're not really able to observe our own chimp. So the chimp is obviously there. It's all about survival. That system is still maturing as well. It's not in full maturation. It can't keep itself safe. It still needs people around it to keep it safe. But around the age of 9 or 10, we have the extraordinary experience that for the first time, we are able to observe our own chimp. So for the first time, the child starts having this experience of, who am I? And is me really me? And we start asking real questions about death and start asking real questions about this higher spiritual side of ourselves. So for the first time, we have what we call the 9-year Rubicon. I'm sure those of you who got class 3s and 4s have all been through that. And you notice this awakening of this higher consciousness. But this sage is not yet mature. That part of the brain is not yet myelinized. By 14 years of age, roughly 13, 14, you actually have that whole survival system is completely myelinized, which in the world of medicine means you now have a fully mature survival system, 100% ready to go and rock and roll. So by the age of 14, 15, in theory, if a child was that, bit of Lord of the Flies kind of thing happening, you let them loose in a jungle, they should be able to start trying to look after their physical survival and being able to try and navigate that. But notice that the prefrontal cortex, or the ego organization, is only going to fully myelinize and be fully completed by 21 years of age. So that lovely picture we have there in the top corner, there, that lovely Great Dane, that's your astral body. And there you've got your little ego organization, or your little sage holding on to your astral body. What's very important is that between 14 and 21, you do have sage activity, and you can engage that sage activity of the child, but it's still very weak. And what primarily has to act on this chimp of the child is your own sage and your own balcony view. And we'll talk some more about that. So if you ever want to talk to your parents about what makes good parenting and what makes good education, actually this understanding of neuroscience explains the whole world of curriculum. So in the first, of course, safety on those 3 levels are important to all the ages. But in the age of under 7, the most important thing for a small child is to feel physically and bodily safe. They must never be in a scenario where they feel that somebody can attack them or physically harm them. That's why we do not do any physical discipline for our children on that age. And at this age, everything we create in the Waldorf curriculum in the kindergarten is creating a safe haven for our children and giving a possibility for that first safety development of that body. So I am allowed to exist as that essential experience that child needs to have. Between the ages of 7 and 14, you need to experience emotional safety. And so in the Waldorf schools, all of our curriculum and the way we present our curriculum is to help the child and engage through their emotions with the materials that we are teaching. And we have this wonderful class teacher that's there between the ages of 7 and 14. You've got those 7 years of class teaching where you have one adult that brings love and care to that particular child. And more than anything else in terms of the content of our curriculums, having that figure there that makes the child feel like they're in a safe space is absolutely key to the development of this this maturation of the chimp and the sage. And then of course, between 14 and 21, as that sage is coming into existence, now the child really starts to experience their own self-identity. And now we need to let them have an experience of, I'm allowed to be who I am. I'm allowed to make the choices that I want to take. I decide about what it is that I want to do with my life. I decide about who I am, how I relate to myself, and how I relate to the world around me. Everything we do in our curriculum is built on those foundations, is being able to create this safety for our children and a healthy development of those areas. So what happens when we are not safe? So now we're going to get into the real nitty-gritty. This is the fun stuff, because the chimp has got all these lovely tricks that it does to try and bring down anxiety. The chimp doesn't like to be anxious. And quite often, if you can't solve the issue, then you're going to try and find another way to make you feel like you can control it. So I'm here very strongly using the concept from Shahzad Chamin. He calls them the saboteurs. These are lovely 9 aspects that we can use to bring down our anxiety. So they're mechanisms, they're little tricks that we all have, and we create them in childhood. So no matter how lovely your parents are, or how perfect your teacher was, or how wonderful the environment is you grow up in, as children, we always have times where we're going to feel unsafe. The world is a weird and inexplicable place. We misunderstand things. We quite often can't always get what we want and feel like we want. And so we have phases where we feel anxious and unsure. And of course, as a child, you can't control your environment very helpfully. And so you find little ways to make yourself feel like you are managing and you are surviving in that scenario. So they're quite complex patterns of behavior created within the astral body. And all that they do is they reduce stress. So they make you temporarily feel a little bit better. They're actually initially been created because they're quite useful in physical threats to safety. So if you're a small child and your dad comes home drunk and violent and you run away and you go hide under the bed, that's probably a clever thing to do. But it's very stupid in relationships. So if you're having a fight with your husband or your wife and you're having to sort something out and you run away and go hide under the bed, that's not going to help resolve that issue. So the problem is that our chimp instincts are very much based around physical safety, but it does not help us negotiate complex relationships. So the first thing to learn is when anybody is behaving badly, when it's anybody else is doing something where you think, oh, he's being such a dick, then there's usually a saboteur in play. And let's look at those saboteurs. So the first thing, before we look at the saboteurs, I just want you to look at this table. And these are just some of the very many strengths that we all might have. Because of course, our saboteurs, our dark side is also based on our light side. And if you look at some of these qualities being analytical intelligence, so that's of your maths intelligence, being able to be discerning, to be able to have love of excellence, to be organized, to be kind, to be protective of others, to be a peacemaker, humility, curiosity, these are all lovely qualities. And these are all qualities that you will all have in different measures as your role as a teacher. So the dark side, we also like in anthroposophy to talk about the double, which always sounds very mysterious. The double is a slightly larger concept than just the dark side. But this is one of the aspects of our double. So the idea is we have these strengths. So when we are in sage and balcony mode, we use kindness, humility, organization, discernment to create a better world around us. But these very same strengths, these very same aspects of ourselves that we can use by the sage can also be used by the chimp to try and reduce our anxiety. And that brings us to this lovely graph. So we're going to go through each of them. And you'll notice on the left here, there are 3 levels. So when we are feeling unsafe, we can either fight, we can either freeze, or we can flee. And that roughly gives us a bit of a graph. And we all use, I think all of us has used all of these 9 in some circumstances, but we all have our favorites. So I want you just to think in the last week of a scenario where you felt quite stressed and you felt unhappy and you were in a conversation or in a situation where you were not happy with how things were going. And in all of those scenarios, you were probably using one of these mechanisms to try and make you feel less stressed. So the most common thing we do when we're feeling slightly unsafe is we criticize. So things are not going well, I'm feeling stressed, and we'll criticize either myself or I criticize the other person. I work in the government. We criticize the government, we criticize the managers, we criticize the latest politicians. So that is a natural way to make us feel slightly more in control. I'm not saying that the ability to analyze or criticize something is a bad thing, but in this scenario, it's not actually helping us understand the situation or helping us get to the bottom of it. Remember, the chimp mode thinks only in black and white, not very bright. Its main focus is just to make us feel slightly better about ourselves. Favorite that a lot of us has in the medical professional, and I'm sure so those of you that are quite academic, is over-analyzing. So we analyze other people, we analyze the children. Oh, anthroposophists, we love analyzing. And again, you're doing it with a certain negative bias that sort of enforces all this vague anxiety, unsafe feeling that you are feeling. For those of you that are very organized, good at Excel sheets, when one can get to the point where you can actually try and organize everybody else when you're feeling stressed. So manipulating those around you. And of course, these things can be quite subtle. So we have subtle ways in how we try and manipulate those around us, but it can also get quite violent if somebody's actually beating somebody else up because they want them to be different or behave differently. That is that fight going into an aggressive form. If we look at the freeze ones, some people who love things to be right and excellent, when they get anxious, they might start fixating on detail and get over perfectionistic and struggle to finish something. You will have kids like this in your class who get so when they're anxious or when they're feeling insecure, can't finish the picture in the main lesson book or simply cannot get the work done because that has to be perfect. Most of you, I'm sure, have a little bit of this, especially women who are very kind or don't like conflict or always want to do the right thing. When we feel a bit anxious, we can just try and please the other person, sometimes in sacrificing ourselves in the process. Worrying, we all do, especially late at night. Again, you're in chimp mode and the brain's now on paranoid, vigilant, and you just think of all the possible things that can go wrong, everything that is possibly going to happen tomorrow or could have happened or shouldn't have happened. And of course, what's happening with worrying is it's, again, not got any perspective. You're not seeing the bigger picture. You're not able to think in context. And it's actually a mechanism that makes you feel temporarily slightly reduce your stress levels. But of course, it's building more stress levels as you worry. And then we all do little bits of avoidance every now and then. So you get some people who just never engage in conflict. So if there's going to be a major thing that's going to go down in the meeting, they don't show up for the meeting. If there's something happening at school they don't want to deal with, they just don't show up for school. Another one on the avoidance side is people who don't engage with what's actually happening, but just feel sorry for themselves. And then, of course, distracting is the classic one that we all use. So this is the basis also of most of your addictions. So when you can't deal with your anxiety and the anxiety is too much, then I reach for my cigarettes, I reach for my glass of wine, I reach for my marijuana, I reach for my Netflix binge, I reach for my social media. So we have things that can distract us, but doesn't actually help us sort this thing out. All of these things have in common is that what they normally quite often do is they certainly don't resolve whatever is causing the stress. And they have a really good potential of actually making things worse. So I want to give you an example. So imagine now you're in a scenario, imagine you're sitting in a college meeting and somebody criticizes you or even shouts at you, kid in your class, or just ignores you flat, or tries to manipulate you to get you to do something that you don't want to do, or brings every suggestion you bring up with negativity. In that scenario, what happens is that person is in chimp mode. You can notice those are all chimp activities. Makes your anxiety go up, your chimp kicks in. And the rule is that a chimp action will usually elicit an even greater chimp reaction. So this is one of our challenges in a meeting is if you have somebody who is, for whatever reason, they might be bringing something from home where they're not feeling happy, or you've got a kid in your class who's bringing something from home and is not feeling happy, and now they are themselves bringing negativity into the classroom, and now it lights up the chimps of other people who are feeling unsafe, and now you start getting a little chimp reaction, and that we call a chimp war. So a nice example of a chimp that gets out of control, a chimp that's completely off leash, is a proper little chimp tantrum. Oh, I'm sure you've all had at least one classroom chimp tantrum. And what happens is person's not feeling safe for whatever reason. And this is a way to reduce anxiety, but it's not necessarily the best way to resolve the situation. So you can recognize a chimp rant by one of them all of the following: high-pressured speech, righteous indignation, increased volume, inability to listen, dominating the conversation, interrupting every time you try and say something. And in these scenarios, what quite often happens is we would describe people like that as being unreasonable, as being full of nonsense, or she's being a bitch, or he's being an arsehole, or and we quite often don't recognize the fact that that person is just in a chimp mode. They've been trapped and caught in that astral mode. And that amazing sage is there, but it's currently been obliterated by this chimp. So great, we're going to take a break in 5 minutes, but we're going to do something fun before we take the break. And this is just for us to practice a little bit or just become aware of how skillful our chimps are. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you 3 scenarios, the 3 classroom scenarios, and I would like you to reach for the chat again. And I'm going to ask you to put in the chat for me ways in which you can make a scenario like this worse, right? It's always very easy to have a long discussion on how we're going to solve this. We'll talk a bit about this later, but it's much easier to know how to make something worse. So we're here in kindergarten and 3-year-old Jimmy does not want to join in. He's sitting outside in the sandpit and ignores the teachers when they call him. And I want to know an example of what can a teacher do in kindergarten that's going to make this situation a lot worse. And just to remember, little Jimmy here is actually obviously feeling unsafe for some reason, might be something from home, he might just be something going on in his physiology, and he's currently avoiding. So if you feel brave, give us an idea, maybe not something you've ever done, maybe you've seen a colleague, seen it on TV, but we've all have our days where we've made things a little bit worse rather than better. If you're at home and you're watching the recording, also just things, great. So we've got some things coming in here. So one can continue to shout to him to join. That's right. Just come on in and keep on badgering him to come in. Criticizing is a classic one. Why are you sitting out there? Why are you not joining in? What is wrong with you? A classic one that I think we're quite good at that in Waldorf, but one of the things that you often your parents in supermarkets do when they sit down and they do long explanations, that falls a little bit into manipulating and over-analyzing and trying to explain the child into actually behaving, which makes the child feel even more unsafe and usually is not very good at preventing that behavior or making that behavior better. So our next example is Felicity. So little 10-year-old Felicity has changed over the last few months. She used to be a hard worker, producing beautiful main lesson books, and she was super helpful in class. And now she's falling behind. She's not finishing her drawings. And today she ripped a page out of her main lesson book and burst into tears. Great. So can we again have some examples of how can you make a scenario like this worse? What kind of thing can you say? You can actually put an actual sentence in, or you can describe what you might do. And what's interesting is that as soon as we've got this little chimp model in our head, one can already start thinking in the back of your mind, what is going on for Felicity that she is suddenly now fixating so much on details and struggling to engage. We're just waiting for some contributions. Those class teachers. Great, we've got fixate on a description of how wrong she is to misbehave. So over-analyzing, so trying too much to sit down and having long, why, quite often we sometimes even almost interrogate, trying to figure out why you're not doing this, what's going on with you. And it's just to realize that when we are doing it, it's not just saying that we don't want to get to the bottom of it. We'll talk about that after the break. But what is happening is we are engaging with them when they're in chimp mode. And the big thing to understand is as soon as you're using your own chimp methods to engage with somebody else in chimp mode, all that's going to happen is you're just going to make things worse and it's not going to resolve things. So there's another one, avoid engaging with her. So sometimes you might have kids in your class that's behaving badly or difficultly and you just ignore them. Oh, I like that. The trouble with you is, there we go. That's a nice analysis as well. Thank you very much for all the lovely inputs. So my third scenario. So Carl loves sports and he's an excellent basketball player. He's a polite and friendly 15-year-old in the classroom, but he's becoming increasingly aggressive on the sports field. His coach is the referee for a game against a neighboring school when Carl loses his temper and accuses his coach being unfair and calls him a bastard. So give us an example of how a teacher can make this situation worse. For those of you who's ever taught a little bit of sport or been in a scenario where you get a child, especially your teenagers, suddenly having a little chimp tantrum. Get my chat up. People are thinking. There's already some instinctual replies possibly coming up. And I think it's interesting. We sometimes attend, obviously, like my child is in one of the local schools here, and when you attend the games and you see how the coaches behave next to the field. So yeah, one can be fixating on details in somebody like this. That was still for I think for Felicity. Some ideas on what we can do to make Carl behave badly. I'll bring one suggestion that I've certainly seen is usually the favorite thing when a kid swears at you is to swear back. There we go. Tell him how disappointed I am in him. Oh, yes. Can't understand why he's overreacting. You can do a total guilt trip. Well done. So that's nice manipulating. So quite often if you either get your aggressive teacher who might swear back at him or send him off the field or whatever. And then the other side is this thing of using your analysis and manipulating to see if you can use guilt to change his behavior. And interestingly, what's interesting is when we do all of this, or when we see people do all of this, we know it doesn't work. We all know it doesn't work. And yet it's so tempting to go in that direction because our own chimps feel a little bit like we're now doing something. We are engaging with this child. So I'm hoping that's given you a little bit of an impression of these two different modes that we are all in. And after the break, we're going to take a break now till 6:40. So you can go and actually have some dinner and tea if you haven't had yet when you were rushing home from school. We're going to actually now start looking at how do we now use this knowledge to actually influence behavior and work in those situations like we've had 3 scenarios that we've had now, or in other difficult relationships with colleagues, or even in relationships at home when our chimps are coming to the fore. So great, we'll have a little break. I'll also open up, we can have a little bit of a discussion as well when we open up after the break, just to see when you guys have had a bit of time to digest your biscuit and some of these new ideas. Any major worries or problems at the moment before we take a break? Okay, cool. Okay, I'm glad. Thanks for the feedback on the pace. That's great. It's always a bit strange when you're talking to Zoom because you have no idea where you're landing. Thank you. Great. I'll see you guys in 10 minutes.